Yep.
Hello and welcome to the Flights of Fancy podcast, the aviation or military aviation podcast, where we try to talk about planes you may not have heard and some that you absolutely have. I'm Oliver. With me today is my co host X,
Hi.
and we've got a lovely story of a plane that, frankly, not many people know about. The story starts out with the Società Italiana Ernesto Breda, or otherwise just shortened in the English world to simply Breda. Uh, Breda is a company that made very few, if any, major outbreaks in terms of aviation when you look at it at a sort of grand scale. Breda was never something that was going to ever compare to, say, Hawker, to Supermarine, even companies like Curtiss Wright or Mikoyan and Gurevich, and so on and so forth. However, they do have a small part to play in Italian aviation throughout the years. Now, to go back to the start, we have Mr. Ernesto Breda, which obviously is what the company is named after. The company began life in 1886 after its acquisition of a mechanical and railway company located in Milan itself. Now, after its acquisition, it grew uh, to quite a large size, going from 35 square kilometers in 1895 to 45 square kilometers in 1900, and having varying staffing capacity. The numbers I could find, which unfortunately are a little spotty as far as I can tell, vary between 400 in 1887 to 2000 in 1889, before dropping down to less than half that at 800 somewhere around the turn of the century, maybe a little bit later. It's mentioned in Wikipedia articles and anywhere else I could find that it was due to a quote unquote period of crisis. Sadly, I don't really know what exactly that would refer to. Um, Another thing I'd like to point out is there's so few pictures available online that this one taken straight from Wikipedia still has a little bit of watermark here. So whoever originally uploaded this, yeah. In any case, getting back to the company itself, the company, having started originally as a mechanical and railway company, branched out in quite a few different ways. Mostly it would stick within those realms, but you also had stuff like wagon construction, wagons specifically for trains, cartridges in terms of ammunition, cannon turning, boilers, agricultural machinery, so on and so forth. To the point where they became a major player in production capacity within Italy. Now, there were issues at times. I believe there's a story about how during World War One, I believe the availability of steel in Italy wasn't exactly the greatest. To the point where the company wanted to make sure that its supply would never run dry, and even had their own cast iron foundry, which, as far as I can tell, is or as far as I know, anyways, rather important deal. Now, to continue on with the workshops themselves, unfortunately, again, not too many available photos of the workshop space, but they decided to expand, as we've seen or as discussed with the branching out, which became quite a fortuitous step for them because, as mentioned, World War One began, and hey, there's an up and coming company, lot of market space. They already have workshops available and are ready to produce just about anything in the mechanical sense that a burgeoning military would suddenly want. So you now had a company that is able to produce anything that the military would absolutely require, and they're raking in the cash at that point. So, as one might assume, workshops are being built. Um, you have cannons, shells, bombs. All of these things are now being produced, and obviously, airplanes are included in that. This is a set of Fiat G50s. Um, Breda didn't always have its own designs. They kind of went back and forth on what they were producing. Sometimes they just had the workshops, so they would license those out so that other companies, like for example Fiat, would be able to produce their designs in these workshops. Um, when it comes to the start of its own aviation branch, it would only really occur after World War One started because they never really had any designers on hand. Now, Ernesto Breda himself passed away in 1918 and left everything to his son, Giovanni Breda. I don't believe I could find a photo for him, unfortunately. The story goes that he takes up the reins of the company, but he's not all too invested in it. Um, I'm sure he wants it to succeed and have it be profitable, but he kind of gives the power of how everything's going to be managed to a director named Guido Sagramoso. Uh, as far as I know, after that, they immediately put money into expanding the aeronautical and locomotive departments. And at that point is when Breda starts developing its own designs. The first design ends up being what's called the Tebaldi Zari, but uh, it's kind of hard to find any like super concrete evidence on how far exactly that goes. You have some other examples like the reconnaissance airplane just titled the A.7, and eventually it goes to the subject of today's episode, the Ba.65 kite, and its predecessor, the Ba.64. Now, the you kind of can't separate the Ba.64 from the Ba.65. As we'll see shortly enough, the two designs are essentially the same with very few modifications to the design overall. Um, think of it as a sort of jumping from a Hurricane 1, or Hawker Hurricane 1 to a Hawker Hurricane 3. A Supermarine Spitfire Mark 1 to a Mark 9. It's within the same family with visual differences and performance differences as well. Um, Continuing on, we know for sure that there are two main designers for the Breda 64, Antonio Parano and Giuseppe Panzeri. I can't find any information on them. I believe Parano has one paragraph on an Italian Wikipedia. How faithful that is to the man himself is hard to tell. The only information I could ever scrounge up is only mentions that he was an aeronautical engineer at the age of 23. He joins Breda at an unspecified time, designs a couple planes, and then is eventually replaced. Uh, I can't find anything that would further provide any sort of information as to his whereabouts after his employment at Breda. And Mr. Panzeri is a complete enigma. There is a mention that there's a third designer named Mario Pittoni. I'm not sure if that's a specific credit for the BA65, if maybe he had input on the BA64 and that sort of got brought along. But once again, finding any sort of concrete details gets a little hard on planes like this, the BA64 and 65. Now, to further go on, the prototype of the BA64, as we saw, is a monoplane, one person aircraft. We can see in the later example, which is a two seater, that they would end up having a second person add in to the plane, And as well, you can see that it's fairly cramped at the front. There's a lot of distance between these two people, and I can't imagine how easy or hard it must have been to communicate any issues, especially in the event of electronic failure. But maybe I'm getting ahead of myself. So the aircraft seen here developed in the early 1930s. Specifically, the Ba.64 took to the skies in 1933 for the first time. It's, as we can see, a low wing cantilever plane with a radial engine. Now, there's two main types of engines for prop planes. Try not to get too into it at the moment, just because probably save that for a future episode. But you typically have a radial engine or an inline engine. Whether it's inverted or not is neither here nor there. We also see that the landing gear doesn't fully retract, which is sometimes referred to as a semi-retractable landing gear. There's a couple other types as well, but not really for discussion today. Um, The aircraft's main design was as a ground attack slash close air support slash assaulter role. They're not too clearly defined, and two of those terms are more of what we think of them as a modern affectation to the term. The original quota was for an assaulter aircraft. But again, today we see that more as a role for close air support. So effectively, this just carries bombs, goes to a designated area, strafes targets, bombs targets, and then leaves. Hopefully, it will have some fighter support, so as not to really have too much to worry about in terms of enemy aircraft that are trying to intercept them. Which, uh, for the purposes of this plane, is the main reason why it ever got a rear gunner. Now, the plane was initially designed to only be to also fit the role of a fighter aircraft, but that was quickly shunted to the side because, well, its performance wasn't all that great. It's hard to really tell through photos, but you kind of get a good grasp on um, just how large an aircraft can be at times, even in these sort of plan views here. Um, Additionally to being a fighter and really a light bomber, essentially, it was also chosen as a reconnaissance aircraft. There wasn't too much in terms of availability for those sorts of roles in the early 1930s for Italy. They had a lot more like float planes, and so this plane sort of was able to fit that dual role. As we move along, we can see that there's a couple of important views for the Ba.64. Notably, we get to see its bomb load and what you would typically see out of the Ba.64 models. Now, there are references in at least one of my books that the Ba.64 was only ever supposed to carry four forward firing guns, and all of them would be 7.7 millimeter in caliber. However, I can't really find anything to back that up. Um, Everything I've seen about this in terms of the various manuals that are out, photos online, etc., they're all basically just uh, two different two different machine guns in one specific setup. Namely, you've got a 7.7 millimeter machine gun on the outer side, and you have an inner 12 millimeter machine gun. So the 7 millimeter is 7.7 is on the outside, and you've got say the 12.7 millimeter on the inside. And to be fair to the design itself, 12.7 and 7.7 millimeter machine guns in the early 30s is not really something to scoff at. This is a lot of firepower from a not overly large aircraft. In fact, comparing it to a lot of other planes of either at the same time or a little bit later, the BA 64 and 65 are more compact than almost all competing designs, which is interesting to think about, considering it's not really again something that's looked at too frequently. I would have expected that the BA-65, while its overall combat performance um, maybe wasn't the most stellar, is definitely something that should be looked at compared to other aircraft of its type. Excuse me. Now, another thing I should mention is that the prototype itself initially had an engine rated at 700 horsepower, but they eventually switched to the Alfa Romeo 125C, which developed 50 horsepower less. That kind of makes it a little bit more astonishing that they could get a lot of this stuff in the air. Because whenever you're downgrading the engine, you're generally speaking taking a good performance loss. Um, Unfortunately, there's only oh so many stats I can take up or find on these engines. Um, I have one book by Bill Gunston, which is supposed to be the a World Encyclopedia of Aero Engines. Sadly, the edition I have doesn't really have all that much information on engines. Um, it's got a few tidbits here and there, but frankly, I'm a little disappointed by how little information there is. And finding information on some of these engines to begin with is already rather tough. Another change we can see with regards to the BA-64 during its production run was the addition of a cockpit or an enclosed cockpit. So instead of having an open area, they eventually gave it a sort of um, what's the word I'm looking for? Uh, Damn, it'll come back to me. Anyways, so they gave it this sort of arrangement, which is interesting because it reveals a sort of standardization that you would see in the Italian Air Forces. Uh, when you look at photos from the early 30s into the 1940s, you'll note that a lot of aircraft, especially the older ones, of course, but a lot of aircraft fly with an open cockpit. They have no fairing. There's no, they wouldn't even have anything to close the cockpit with. And this was seen at the time as an important asset for Italian pilots. They were trained and drilled to observe and fight and perform their aeronautical duties from an open cockpit. And it took a long time for the Italians to actually swap over into the more current way of doing things. Um, which is why you don't really see a change in those aspects until I'd say about 1940 to 41 is generally when you see a very large switch from open cockpit to closed cockpit circumstances. Going further, we've got a little bit more information on the BA-64, specifically where you can just some important stats. So 3,300 pounds empty, 5,500 pounds maximum weight. Maximum weight being loaded to the brim, so full fuel load. Um, I believe the weights are for the dual seater version, and whatever bomb load, max bomb load it could carry. There's also some plans here about the internals. The BA-64 and 65 again are cramped aircraft. They don't have a lot of space within them to for anything really. We can see that you have the main fuel tank, which is right behind the pilot. So your pilot is just about here. So this guy is sitting right in front of his fuel tank. You have side tanks on each side, which are of like a smaller capacity. You have the an additional fuel tank in the bomb bay if you're going on a reconnaissance mission. So if you don't have a huge bomb load required, you typically would have an extra fuel tank below it, which is why you have those varying ranges in the previous slide. You've got the oil tank up top. You've got an oil radiator. I always forget where the oil radiator is. Oil radiator underneath the pilot's feet. You have a hydraulic oil tank, fire extinguisher. Um, the fire extinguisher is yonder, so easy access for the pilot in case anything happens. And you have two. You got air. Excuse me, a fire extinguisher in the rear as well for the second person. But you also have oxygen tanks and an air compressor. So air compressor and oxygen tank is somewhere within this cabin that I've drawn over. Additionally, we have in the wings how it was set up, and this is typical of what you would find on the insides of aircraft wings. Um, you, if you have two different calibers, or if you have multiple guns, you'll generally have one gun's ammo run above the other to then get fed into it shot, and it drops out into a slot, which um, has two different setups. Depending on the nation, you'll either have the spent ammunition or cartridges go into a bag or some form of catch so that they can retrieve it easily and reload it that much faster. Um, or they'll just have everything drop out from the wing itself. I believe in most cases, if they're going to retrieve anything, it'll be the belt links because they're harder to make and replace. The cartridges is usually assumed to not be too worthwhile to keep. And again, we can see that because there's two different calibers, the in the wing itself, the arrangement was always that the 12.7 would be its boxes would be in front of the 7.7, which is why you have a slightly different setup and why these look slightly different. That is. Next up, we have some traditional bomb loads. Bomb loads get kind of weird. Not a lot of people discuss them, as far as I know. Um, Typically, you won't have set bomb loads like you'll see on the left side here. The right side is a little bit special, but the bomb loads here are is kind of what they would generally recommend or generally fly with. There's nothing that stops you from, say, taking two 100 kilogram bombs and then substituting the two that you've lost, the 200 kilograms that you've now made space for, and maybe supplementing it with some 70 kilogram bombs instead. It more or less depends on what the mission is. We can see that we've got some anti-ship bombs. There's a couple of anti-personnel ones. Um, we got some fragmentation ones. We've got a couple of incendiary types. And there's also my favorite, the anti-air bombs. Um, I've got a nice post on a blog of mine that talks about anti-air bombs. Um, that'll probably have to be an episode of its own. Additionally, the Ba.64 was not a unique plane to have a special or spezzonatrici longitudinali, which basically means that it was a contraption that would be installed in the bomb bay. There were two main arrangements. One was a longitudinal setup, and there's one that was transversal or trasversale up here. Basically, how it worked was that it was, think of a carpet and or like a giant a game of Connect Four, like that board, and every hole had a bomb in it. And upon pressing the bomb release button, these hooks would retract, and it would dump all of these little bomblets. You can also see the same sort of thing utilized by Russian IL-2s in World War II in a more either anti-personal or anti-vehicle um, uh, attack type. Just a couple extra details here to give you an idea of how everything was set up or what the options were. So on the top right here, we can see what the setup is for the machine guns and how it looks compared to where the pilot is. So we can see the pilot is rather close to his engine, open cockpit. It's probably really loud for that person. Gunner in the rear with his own machine gun, typically a 7.7 millimeter machine gun with its own feed system and ammunition supply. We can see on the top right that the wings would generally carry most, if not all, illustrations show small bombs. Typically, they'd be 8.8 kilogram bombs, so not very large, not very destructive, more just for like anti personnel, harassing attacks, that sort of thing. But we can see that I believe there's 12. So you'd have 12 of these plus some bombs in the bomb bay if they're carrying it that way, and we can see what the special bombs would look like. So we can see it's kind of like a giant Connect Four board. Um, you could also think of it, I guess, as like a chainmail, and each one of these holes or rings is a separate bomb. So you're typically seeing groups of 152 to 200 plus. I think there was in the previous slide there was about 300 in as one of the options. Now, um, the prototype for the BA-64 kind of didn't always have all this stuff. It was kind of tested mostly without its armament until it got the two-seater variant. And with all these tests, with all this, the production that you would see with the BA-64, which was not very high, the BA-64 only had about 42 examples, as far as I can find, ever built. Not a stunning number, but the BA-65 sort of followed up rather quickly. The turnaround time between the 64 and 65 was maybe 2 years. Any info I can find states that the prototype for the 65 only first flew in 1935, and it kept the light and heavy machine gun setup. Um, for whatever reason, they still had some produced as a single seat fighter, but those never really amounted to anything. And again, rather quickly, they would move to a twin seat setup, or a two-seat setup, I should say. We've got a couple examples here of both the BA-65, the BIS or BIS, which generally stands for an upgraded model. Um, it's interesting because Italy and France are about the only ones that ever use this designation. So how it normally works is you'd have uh, BA-65 for the original. If there's an upgrade, it would be BA-65 BIS or BIS. And if you have a third model, it would be Tre. So TRE. And I'm going to maybe start writing on my graph thing just to make it easier. But you'd basically have Tre as the third. I believe it's Latin. So bis is two and Tre is three. The main reason why I have all these photos here is that you'll notice if you're ever looking for planes, there's very interesting ways to tell some planes apart. So, notably for the BA-65, to tell between a BA-65 and a 64, 65 does not have an open panel on its side. If you look at photos of the BA-64, you'll notice there's always a sort of radiator panel on the side. It does not exist in the in the 65 version. Additionally, the cowling is very different for a 65 versus a 64. Namely, the 65 just has all these little bumps on it, which only exist in order to give clearance for the engine. So where all these, I want to call them gaskets for no reason in particular, they're cylinders, but where these cylinders are placed roughly equates to how this radiator, how the cowling is manufactured, and it's why there's a major difference between the BA-65 and the BA-65 BIS. In its cowling, we can see that it's all straight edges, implying that the engine is different, first and foremost, but more specifically, that they wanted to make the cowling very, very tight for the radial engine. Um, we can still see that in the BIS version, the landing gear is still semi-retractable. That's why we can still see the wheels while they're up. And while this guy does have a second seat in it, there doesn't seem to be any sort of armament. So this is most likely a reconnaissance aircraft. The lack of bomb load doesn't really say too much, just because they could be returning from anything, and the photo doesn't quite give us enough information or visibility on, say, any sort of bomb attachments under the wings, sadly. As we go further, there's a little bit of information and confusing information, sadly, for the BA-65, which I think is going to be a running issue with this podcast, in the sense that when it comes to less well documented aircraft, there is more um, opportunity for mistakes to be made. Um, Namely, this photo and attribution is wrong. So, first and foremost, the BA-65 BIS, again, we can see um, I'm not quite sure why the cowling is drawn this way, because we've seen in the previous slide the BIS is different. So that cowling immediately should be of a different nature. Again, this is more a reconnaissance example because there's no gunner in the rear. But as well, this turret is not an L turret. This turret is an M turret, and we'll get more into that later. Um, a couple figures to point out. The aircraft, as designed, took the Gnome Roan K-14 radial engine. Um, this is about an equivalent, the Zota Fraschini K-14. This is just a photo of them stacked all together, I believe in 1944, 43. Um, Basically, the Isotta Fraschini was just a licensed copy of the Gnome Roan, and these would have been built. Um, Typically, they were bought from France, but with Germany, well, with France capitulating, Germany taking over the factories, you don't really have a main supplier for those, technically. So it gets a little harder to get those, and they would eventually switch to a different design, um, as seen. Um, The bomb load that was originally carried in the B-64 was roughly 1,200 kilograms. Oh, sorry, it was 600 kilograms, and in the 65, it was doubled to 1,200 kilograms. Uh, this is a fairly large number. There's a lot of the conversion between pounds and kilograms. I feel gets tends to catch people out sometimes. You're typically looking at a kilogram as being, or your in this example, 1,200 kilograms would be roughly about 2,200 pounds. You're doubling, but like 90%. Um, you Again, the 65, like its earlier uh, predecessor, could have a multitude of different bomb loads. So you you see a lot of either maxed out bomb loads, or you would see changes, um, such as having the special transversal or longitudinal bomb loads, um, several 100 kilogram bombs all stacked together, and having stuff on the wings, etc., etc. Continuing on with its use as a bomber and reconnaissance aircraft as well, you have two main types. We'll see the type L a little bit later, and the type M side by side. But the type M in a very doctored photo here. But the type M and type L essentially are just a difference in terms of rear gunner equipment. We can see that the Ba.65 in this undershot, tail wheel would go here, and this is the front of the plane. We can see that it's got some windows here. And the windows here is mainly for reconnaissance purposes. It was included in all the planes in its design, um, but typically you would never, you don't really have you have no view of it from the pilot seat, and I don't believe the rear gunner slash observer would ever have too good of a field of view through there. Um, what it really would serve is when in a reconnaissance mode, you would have the plane essentially carry a camera that is pointing through these glasses, depending on how exactly the setup was made. And as they fly over, you then hit a trigger, and camera takes photos from then on. Again, we can see how the bomb load would be stored. You're still looking at your pilot that is right here, and whose legs will go to about here. And yeah, so it's still a very cramped aircraft, depending on what type of setup you have. You still with me, X?
Yeah, yeah,
Cool,
I'm here.
cool. Just making sure you're not dead.
Just not 100% sure when to interject.
Hey, whenever you want, buddy.
Okay.
If there's anything that you want to talk about or is interesting, just go on.
Yeah, one thing
Sure.
kind of worth mention is that's a lot of bomb load for an internal carriage. The U.S. basically had one interwar plane that was fitted with an internal bay, and that was the Brewster designed SBA that got, well, it didn't get built by the Naval Aircraft Factory because U.S. production in some senses was a mess.
Hmm.
It's a good thing they had a lot of companies to do this because some weren't great. That had a 500-pound bomb load, so that's 270 or something kilograms. On the plus side, it had huge range, which was really kind of the goal of the thing.
Mm-hmm.
But everything else was carrying 1,000-pounders outside the plane on a centerline crutch.
Right. And it's that crush in a dive bomb, like for a dive bomber. So it's throwing that bomb outside of that propeller arc, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah. Speaking of actually how to throw bombs around, this is actually a super interesting image because I've rarely ever seen um, the actual device for this. So, in the example of having 12 bombs, as this setup has, we can see that this is how, or at least as far as I can tell from the translation, unless I did it very wrong. The way I understand it is that these notches is what exactly tells or throws off the bomb from its current hook. So you just follow the numbers, obviously 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, etc. And basically, what this does is that is what generates your pattern. So when the armorers are loading this, they know exactly which bombs are dropping in what order, and it's kind of how you can lead with a couple bombs that are say incendiary in type versus some that may be AP or etc. And I believe this is a very common factor for all nations, but it's something that rarely ever gets mentioned or talked about. Um, Now there is a side note that I need to make in that for in the example of say a Heinkel HE-111, a BA-7, B-17, etc. Um, Planes with very large bomb loads would obviously load them in different ways, and more or less when it comes to say a B-17, they're loading them in such a way that they're simply dropping, and there's no pattern to ever be built. If you want your first bombs to be of a certain type, those are just the last ones you load in into the plane. Um, so going through my notes, talked about the open cockpit, but interestingly, the rear gunner got a hydraulically operated turret, which wasn't very much the style at the time. A lot of earlier planes would only have an open rear, as we can see here, open rear for your observer to look out of and shoot through. Typically, when enclosed, this gun would just slip into this hole here, and like there's a covering. It kind of just opens up a little bit. You tuck the machine gun in, and that way it's not sticking out at all times. But we can see that
Yeah.
it does have a nice little belt here that's feeding through. A lot of other nations, I kind of made it a little bit more complicated on themselves. Germany is a really good example in this, in that because of the machine guns that they used, such as the MG13 or even just MG81s and MG34s and so on, they typically would use their drum belts because they had them, and it was kind of easier to produce or acquire rather than having to produce a design that had this mechanism in it. And so you'll see Stukas forever that still run on drum mags rather than an actual belt feed system.
Yeah. The Americans liked the idea of turrets for rear guns on their strike planes, but they seem to have a hard time getting things going. One of the first ones to try that was Brewster's second attempt at a decent dive bomber, which didn't turn out too well, and they had to get rid of the turret for weight reasons.
Mm-hmm.
But you eventually see it showing up on their bigger torpedo bombers. The dive bombers, they never really wound up putting a full-on turret, which is interesting.
Yeah, I don't think the SBD, which is the most popular dive bomber they had, I don't think that ever even got a prototype with a turret. I don't think.
No, it didn't. The SBD had two 30 millimeter guns in the back,
Yes.
and the next time they got some more weight for improvements, they added self-sealing fuel tanks, crew armor, and all that good stuff. The other heavily, decently armed plane was the Vought SB2U, and that wound up being overweight. So it wasn't performing great, but it did have a 50 cal in back. But again, no turret.
Right.
Rooster tried, and I think there were attempts with the SB2C in the middle of the war, but that never got anywhere, and they just did it all the old-fashioned way.
Right.
The SB2C was a little bit of a mess.
Well, hopefully we'll get to that episode not too far from this one.
Yeah, because that's a good story. It's it's a mess, and also it's the frontline dive bomber of the U.S. Navy for the second half of the war. How did that happen?
Desperation. This also gives a really good idea for people who don't necessarily know about the internals of aircraft. Um, we can see that there's a very large like box structure to your aircraft, and well, we see all these curved surfaces around it. So planes are typically hollow, especially when it comes to the tail section. More so for single engine aircraft. But if you're ever wondering how people can store certain things, there's typically like a hatch or something. You see it on stuff like the Supermarine Spitfire. The BF 109 has a door specifically for a medic or a first aid kit. And once radio and radar becomes more of a thing, you'll sometimes see some doors for those sorts of things. And it's also how you can, if you've ever wondered how some people were able to have harrowing tales of sneaking people out of countries or off of attacked airfields so that they can fly to the next one with their pilots. Say, like if a mechanic wanted to hide in here, as long as the door is large enough and the plane can sustain that sort of increased weight, there's nothing that prevents someone from being in here, provided they don't mess with any of these control cables, of course.
Yeah, that would be bad. Also, there are some limits as to what you can stuff in the tail before the plane becomes tail heavy and everything goes horribly wrong.
Correct. You'll see. There's a lot of stories of IL-2s that actually do that, where they would have, say, a mechanic or somebody that would get into the tail of a plane, or sometimes just in the rear, crammed in with somebody else, and sometimes it goes well, and other times it does not, sadly for them. But these two photos side by side is more or less just to illustrate the differences between the two turret types, and also to clear up something that I had to discover myself. So the top one is a Tipo L, and the bottom one is a Tipo M. And unfortunately, the only major book I know that talks about a lot of Italian planes, called the Civil and Military, or Italian Civil and Military Aviation, from 1930 to 1945. I have the attributed source at the end of this. Um, he's like the only one that I've ever known to write an entire book on all different Italian aircraft, and sadly made that error. So he calls a Type M a Type L, and misses out on a couple of things. So another interesting thing that I feel is only ever, I think a couple Russian aircraft also had it, but the Type M turret actually had its gun offset, which is not something you see very often. Um, you'll see a lot of turrets in British or American designs where both guns are centered, or where your view is in the center and both guns are equally offset to the left and right, but never in a fully offset configuration like the Type M turrets. We can also see here that crumple zones is not something that you should ever worry about if you're a pilot. If you ever crash, you're probably dead anyways, because your feet end here.
Yeah, it looks like the pilot is the crumple zone.
That basically there's enough space here for a firewall if you're lucky, and any thoughts and prayers that you might be able to fit in here in the event of an emergency. Um, Also, just wanted to point out as well that the bomb bay is right behind the pilot. And if you're wondering where everything else went, well, you got your fuel tank here and all the other stuff that we discussed earlier on the sides. That's where you'd find them. Um, Oil tank and so on and so forth. And while it doesn't show all too well on here, we can see here is the camera, or at least as far as I can tell, that's the camera, because nothing else should be sticking out there. So you have the camera here as well in the Type M. Unless the top part is the seat, but the bottom part should absolutely be the camera. Again, there's nothing else that should be here in any other plan I've seen. Nothing else goes to those areas. Now, sadly, speaking about overweight and other issues, there's the BA-65 was never a successful aircraft. While the 64 only ever had 42 examples produced, which is a terribly low number, even for a prototype and experimental aircraft, the 42 is not a number to really brag about. And the BA-65 was along the same lines. Records show that there's about 200, a little over 200. I think the number changes between 201 and 215, depending on who you ask and what your sources are. But typically, that's as much as the BA-65 or Kite, as it eventually was named, ever amounted to. There's a few orders that were placed outside of the Regia Aeronautica. Um, but never anything to substantiate the desire to continue producing. Its combat rating was never great. It absolutely relied on fighter cover. Its maximum speed and likely that being very much reduced under a full bomb load. 2,200 pounds is astonishing for this thing to carry, but certainly something that will absolutely tank your performance in the air. You're getting caught out by Gloucester Gladiators in 1939, which is not a good thing if you know anything about planes. And in terms of North Africa, once 1940 rolls around and Italy is joins the Axis powers, you're now seeing Gloucester Gladiators being supplemented by Bristol Blenheims in some cases that are in an attack or slash fighter capacity. You have Hurricanes that are now entering into the fray. You have Hawk 75s, Tomahawks in other nomenclature, so on and so forth, and all of these planes are more than a match for the BA-65. At most, one could argue that a BA-65's top speed is higher than a Gloucester Gladiator and probably ranging in the same areas. Um, if maybe like 20 kilometers, maybe slower than some other fighters, but that's at max speed and likely running away from its adversaries then under a full bomb load going into combat. Um, Despite any sort of crap I may give it or negative aspects I might attribute to the BA-65, um, the Italian wiki does give it a favorable mention. Um, but only specifically to what would occur at the start of the conflict between British and Italian forces in North Africa, specifically Libya and the surrounding area. Namely, that during Operation Battle Axe, and I believe Compass as well, the BA 65 was the only aircraft that the Italians had that was designed for a close air support role. And in that aspect, it was capable of flourishing, provided there's no uh, interceptors. There's not really much in terms of air defense, which it could do because, well, British forces would typically run ahead of those forces, or at the very least, there's enough Italian fighter presence in the area at the time that they can provide some support to BA-65s. But typically, you would find them, unfortunately, in the same circumstances as I believe this. I believe this is an Iraq BA-65. I forget if it's. Let's see what. Oh man. Let's see what the source is here.
That not Rand Randall is, yeah.
Yeah. You can also see the script here for the Iraqi Air Force that basically just spells out 118. This was just a different way of writing it. Um, Again, because you never really saw BA-65s outside of Italy, you're also not really replacing them. So losses like this for a third party is that much worse for them. And at the bottom, type L, just to show off again how exactly the turret is for it and what the feeding systems are. So two different, uh, well, I believe one's air and the other's cartridges, or it might just be for, actually, I think this is recuperation, but still.
Interesting. Also, the Anglo-Iraqi war didn't go too well for the Iraqis anyway, so
Unfortunate. Well, I guess fortunately for the Anglos, depending on, I don't really want to take a side on that, anyways.
I don't even know if that particular fight was all that relevant to modern occurrences.
Certainly not to World War II. It's very much a sideshow. Um, I should point out that the turret, the Type L, I believe, always carried a 7.7, and the Type M, I believe, carried a 12.7 millimeter machine gun. Unfortunately, there's not much information on this. Again, going to my two sources, Italian Civil and Military Aircraft, and a secondary book called Courage Alone, the Italian Air Force during the Second World War. I believe that's the title. Both are very good books for anybody interested in Italian aircraft. But Courage Alone mentions a 12.7 millimeter machine gun. The Italian Civil and Military Aircraft book does not. Um, I should also point out that the Type L here could cover a vertical traverse of plus 90 degrees, so all the way vertical, and 70 degrees downward. Although this wasn't possible at all angles. Certainly not right over its tail, but on the sides you can get that minus 70, which is nice, I guess. It could also only traverse 80 degrees horizontally, which is why this is not a full circle. Um, the Type M, I believe, has no issues with the 360-degree capacity, I guess we'll call it. The only other things to really mention is I wanted to find something notable for these aircraft as we'll go along, depending on how popular or unpopular some of these aircraft are. This will be a little hard. I already mentioned the Operation Battle Axe and Compass stuff, which, notable as they may be, there's nothing to completely support it. Again, the only positives I could find were on the Italian Wikipedia. There's no mention in English works of their contribution to the war effort there. The only thing I could find was that there is a mention for a flight of three Ba.65s that were able to destroy a bridge at Flix during the Spanish Civil War. Um, three bombers, three ground attack aircraft, taking out an iron bridge, three planes, and 600 kilograms of bombs to work with. It's frankly surprising. The only way I can confirm this is that on the bridge's website itself in Flix, there is a mention of how it was under attack several times during the Spanish Civil War and not only destroyed but rebuilt several times. And I think, yeah, this page left intentionally blank because all military books tend to do that, or manuals,
Hmm.
anyways. A couple last points going through my notes. Um, Stuff like the Hawker Hurricane, when it comes to the North African conflict, they're traveling some like 100 plus kilometers an hour faster than a BA-65. Kind of gives you an idea as to how slow BA-65 actually is, which is not
Yes.
great for its purposes. Um, the single machine gun in the back, by 1940 standards, 7.7 millimeter machine guns are not the way to go. It was tried with the Hawker Hurricane, having up to 12 machine guns. Um, and generally speaking, everybody tended to go towards cannon firepower in the 15, 20, 30 millimeter capacities because it was just easier. If you ever got a hit, you were more than likely guaranteed to do a sufficient amount of damage to cripple an aircraft.
Yeah. Plus, when I say armor and self-sealing fuel tanks, that means a lot of the really juicy targets for rifle caliber rounds, like seven whatever, are
Hmm.
going to be protected, and suddenly those shots aren't going to like kill the pilot or break the cooler. So there's a lot less vulnerability to those guns.
Yes, as opposed to the BA-65, where your armor is the bomb load you're currently carrying.
Ooh, yeah, that's unfortunate. That is a comparative lack.
Unfortunately, I can't find anything about, like, speaking specifically of armor. Although I have several manuals on the planes themselves, I never saw anything that mentioned armor specifically. It could just be a detail that was left out. It could be something that just wasn't on the plane, so there's nothing to mention. Um, if anybody can find me a source, that'd be great. But as far as I can tell, it wasn't an armored aircraft, which kind of speaks to its design of a 1933/35 aircraft, in which that sort of mentality just didn't exist back then. Um,
Yeah.
the the fact that it traveled, the BA-64 and 65 wasn't anything to scoff at in 1933. Up to maybe 1936, it's doing a good job for what it was designed for. Harkening back to the days of post World War One, when I forget his name, but there was an Italian general, unless it was a different rank, but there was a high-ranking military member in the Italian forces that wrote doctrine about how the bomber would always get through.
Oh,
So
that'd be Julio Duhay.
yes, so there was the idea that the bomber would always get through because they fly higher than fighters, and so they're going to bomb soft targets. And that philosophy held true until faster fighters existed, and you only ever got that at the start of the BF 109, the Supermarine Spitfires lifetimes. Once those planes were actually built, developed, designed, and flying, they would reach speeds that would far outclass bombers, and that was realistically the decline of the mentality of the bomber will always get through. Um, there was no more safety for aircraft, and with it, a design like the BA-64/65 was never going to succeed. Um, the only way you could would be to drastically reduce its bomb load, give it more armor. You're at a certain point, you're better off just redesigning or scrapping it and going for a new design, depending on how the company wishes to further itself or how the military wants its designers to go. Um, and that's why you would see the BA-65 would get phased out. By 1941, it's only ever used in training capacity, and the proposed successor to it would never realistically get its time to shine either. Um the Breda 88 Lince was, or Lynx, I guess, in American terminology, would never amount to the same. Um, it was also not a very great design, and in a future episode, I'm sure we'll also cover that. To finish out a few points, uh, there are mentions in um, mid 1941 to, I believe, 1943. By the time they had surrendered, there was still a few BA-65s in inventory. Um, I don't have any proper source on this. There is a mention that they were refitted. BA-65s are refitted as dive bombers, and given the title BA-65M, I don't have a photo. I've never seen anything to suggest that is true. But like with a lot of other designs or propositions, it may have a hint of truth. It may be completely true, and just not something that was ever seen as something worthwhile in capturing the details specifically. Which is why you have a lot of people 70 years after the fact or more, discovering new things about these old planes. Um, The total numbers again, 201 to 28 to 218 airframes were built. They would go on to four squadrons, or mainly four squadrons in the Italian Air Force. Of the entire run of 201 to 28, 218, you would see about 25 examples go to Kingdom of Iraq, as seen in an earlier slide. You would see Chile would get about 20. Portugal would get 10, Spain would get 11, but it should be noted that the all the Spanish aircraft, um, the they received more, but 11 of them specifically were sold to them. So in the Spanish Civil War, they would bring some over, and any left over, hey, you know what? It's take them. The numbers generally refer to them getting about 23, but 11 of them were sold. There is a mention of the Soviet Union receiving 10 of them, but it's not clear as to whether or not they were purchased or captured. Um, with regards to the BA-64, I believe three of them were sold to the Soviet Union. So they actually had some experience with the plane before conflict ever started. And there was also a mention of, I believe on the Italian wiki for the BA-65, that the Republic of China was looking into purchasing some. There was a request or a mission to Italy to investigate such a proposition, but unfortunately, it never really amounted to anything. Um, there's never, I haven't seen anything about a follow up, and there's nothing that would suggest that a BA-64 or 65 ever made its way to the Pacific Theater, and certainly not for that purpose. Um, the only other thing to mention, the sources are all here. There's a few sources that I may not have listed. Stuff like all the specific searching for certain photos. A lot of photos came from Wikipedia or the books that I use myself. If they weren't, they're taken from Pinterest. And you know what? Those guys don't have claim to some of these 80-year-old photos. If it was something that was recorded 10 years ago, then I'll source that properly. A Wikipedia article for a 90-year-old photo is not one of them. Um,
Yeah.
Only other things I can mention is Italian Civil and Military Aircraft 1930-1945 by Jonathan W. Thompson. It's a really good book. Look into it if you're interested in that specific time period. It's probably the most comprehensive single book on those types of aircraft, and it's a great starting location if you want to get an interest in those. Courage Alone, the Italian Air Force in 1948 to 1943 by Chris Dunning, unfortunately does not go into a lot of the earlier stuff. It does touch those subjects, but there's a lot of detail, and frankly, it's an amazing book. Um, Buy it. I can't recommend that book enough. Um, Bill Gunston's book sucks, but I'm willing to give it that maybe it was an earlier edition that I have. It's just very limited on any information. Even popular engines don't really get talked about too much, which is unfortunate. And I guess I mentioned for aviologs.com for the several manuals that they have. Unfortunately, you have to buy a subscription if you want access to all of them, but still a very nice source for that material. And I think that's it for the BA-64/65. Um,
Yep.
I
One
have.
thing, one thing I think is worth mention is just that overall, nobody had particularly brilliant results with single-engine light bombers. Like the Stuka was all good and well until it ran up against opposition, and
Mm,
then they died a lot. Vought Vindicators got sold to France, and all of them died. Like literally every single one of 40, they got shot down.
yeah.
The Vought Vindicators off Midway, well, the commander of that formation was Lofton Henderson, and he got an airbase named after him posthumously that year. The U.S. Army decided that there was one dive bomber good enough for its use, the A-24 Banshee, and in the Philippines, a lot of them died getting shot down because they didn't have great fighter cover, and overall the Army was a lot happier with the A-20.
Hmm.
The A-24 is not a bad aircraft. You know it better under the name SPD Dauntless. So,
Yeah, and stuff like the you also see with stuff like the ferry battle, which
ooh, yeah, that turned out badly.
which never could survive against opponents like the BF 109.
Yeah,
So
that niche in general is a scary, dangerous one to live in.
yeah, so effectively it was a design that worked from the early 30s and quickly shuffled into the graveyard as soon as any sort of modern fighter became readily available or had the kinks worked out of their designs.
Yeah. In fairness, it's pretty heavily armored. Armed for what it is. Two 50 cals and two rifle caliber machine guns up front compares well to basically anything in the U.S. inventory, except for the Vindicators, which they tried putting 450 cals on them, and then the British went, "Hey, we use these for carrier operations, and we literally cannot take these overladen pigs off of our carriers. What gives?"
Yeah. So, I guess that'll be a wrap for first episode. Yay!
Woo!
Not quite sure what'll be the second episode. I've got a bunch of suggestions already, so we'll just basically check things out. If you like this, please stick around. We'll have more. If you didn't, apologies. Thanks for listening.
If you didn't like it, this has been an awfully long time to stick around for your apologies. You've more than earned them.
Hey, look, that's how you get them. You only apologize at the end so that they stick around.
Ah, fair enough.
All right, until next time.
Yep. Have a good one.